I was standing at my husband's grave when my oldest son looked me in the eyes, smiled, actually smiled, and said loud enough for every single person there to hear, "You have no right to anything." The silence that followed was the heaviest thing I have ever felt in my 71 years on this earth. Heavier than the coffin we had just lowered into the ground. Heavier than the diamond ring on my finger that Richard had placed there 43 years ago in a little chapel in Connecticut, with snow falling outside the windows and my mother crying in the front pew. Every face turned toward me. My daughter-in-law Patricia, with her immaculate black dress and her dry eyes. My younger son Daniel, staring at the grass like a coward who had already made his choice but didn't have the courage to own it. The cousins, the neighbors, Richard's business partners in their expensive suits, the woman from our church who had brought us casseroles every Sunday for 30 years, all of them watching, waiting to see what Stephanie Calloway would do. I looked at my son, my firstborn, the boy I had held in the delivery room while Richard wept with joy, the child I had nursed through chickenpox and broken bones and a heart broken by his first girlfriend. And I said nothing. I turned around, and I walked. I walked past the marble headstones, past the oak trees that were just beginning to turn gold, past the small fountain near the entrance that Richard had always said was tacky, but secretly loved. I walked with my back straight, and my chin up, and my heart absolutely shattered into 10,000 pieces inside my chest, because that is what Calloway women do. We walk. We do not crumble in public. We save that for the bathtub at 2 a.m, with the water running so no one can hear. I was almost at the iron gate when I heard footsteps behind me. Fast footsteps, out of breath. I turned, expecting one of the cousins, or maybe Daniel having a last-minute crisis of conscience. But it was Father Michael. Father Michael, who had been our priest for 22 years, who had married our son Thomas in that same church, who had given the eulogy that morning, and made every single person in those pews cry when he talked about Richard's laugh. Father Michael was 74 years old, and he had just crossed the entire cemetery in his vestments, slightly out of breath, holding something in his hand. "Stephanie," he said, and his voice was very gentle. "Richard asked me to give you this," he said, and these were his exact words. He said, "Give this to my wife after they show their true colors. She'll know what it means." He placed an envelope in my hands, old, cream-colored, sealed with wax, Richard's handwriting on the front. Just my name, Stephanie. I looked at Father Michael. He looked at me. And then he smiled. Not the cruel smile my son had given me, but something so warm and so full of quiet satisfaction that I felt, for the first time in 3 days, like I could breathe again. "He loved you very much," Father Michael said, "and he was a great deal smarter than most people gave him credit for." I held that envelope against my chest the entire drive home. I didn't open it in the car. I didn't open it when I walked through the front door of the house that my children apparently believed was already theirs. I made myself a cup of tea, sat down at the kitchen table where Richard and I had eaten breakfast every morning for 38 years, and I opened the envelope. What was inside changed everything. But before I tell you what Richard left me, before I tell you how it all unraveled, how every single thing my children thought they had secured collapsed around them like a house of cards in a thunderstorm, I need to take you back to the beginning, because this story didn't start at the cemetery. It started 43 years ago in that little chapel in Connecticut, with snow on the windows and a young woman who had absolutely no idea what kind of life she was about to build. And before I go any further, if you have ever been betrayed by someone you loved and raised and sacrificed everything for, leave a comment below and tell me your story, because I know I am not alone. Hit that like button if you believe that people who scheme against their own family eventually get exactly what they deserve. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do, because this story is just getting started, and you do not want to miss what comes next. My name is Stephanie Calloway, and this is the story of how my husband saved me from our own children, even from beyond the grave. I was born Stephanie Ann Hargrove in 1953 in a small town in Vermont that most people have never heard of and never will. My father worked at the paper mill. My mother kept the house and grew tomatoes in the backyard and read to us every night before bed. We were not rich. We were not poor. We were the kind of family that fixed things instead of replacing them, that saved all year for a week at the lake in August, that understood the value of what you had because you had worked for every single piece of it. I was the middle child of 3. My older sister Carol was the responsible one, the one who went to nursing school and married a steady man and did everything in the order it was supposed to be done. My younger brother Paul was the wild one, the one who drove my mother gray before her time and ended up, against all odds, becoming a surprisingly decent accountant in Phoenix. And then there was me, the one who read too much and dreamed too much, and was always looking out the window at something that wasn't there yet. I met Richard Calloway in the fall of 1974. I was 21 years old, finishing my last year at the University of Vermont, majoring in English literature, with absolutely no concrete plan for what came after. Richard was 24, already working for his father's construction company, already the kind of man who walked into a room and made it feel more organized just by being in it. We met at a party in Burlington. He spilled red wine on my white blouse, turned the color of a beet, and spent the next 40 minutes apologizing and finding me club soda and dabbing at the stain with a cocktail napkin in a way that was so earnest and so hopeless that I fell a little bit in love with him before he even told me his name. His name, it turned out, was Richard James Calloway. His family was from Greenwich, Connecticut. His father, Harold Calloway, had built a construction business from nothing after the war, and by the time Richard was born, it was one of the most respected firms in the state. Richard had grown up with money, real money, the kind that had been earned and then carefully tended and then passed down. But he had the remarkable quality, rare in men who grow up wealthy, of understanding that money was a tool and not a personality. We dated for 2 years. We were married on December 14th, 1976, in the Congregational Church in Greenwich, where Richard had been baptized, with 37 guests and a reception at his parents' house, and a honeymoon in Montreal, because we both loved French food and couldn't afford Paris yet. I wore my mother's veil, and Richard wore a suit he had bought new for the occasion and cried twice. Once when I walked down the aisle, and once during the first dance, which he thought no one noticed but I always will. We moved into a small house in Westport, Connecticut, that Richard's father helped us buy. 3 bedrooms, a yard, a kitchen that needed updating but had good bones. Richard was working 60 hours a week building the business. I was teaching 3rd grade at the local elementary school and trying to figure out how to be a wife and a professional and a person all at once, which is considerably more complicated than anyone tells you before you get married. Thomas was born in 1979. He came into the world screaming, which should have been a sign of things to come, and he didn't stop being loud for the next 44 years. He was our firstborn, and I loved him with the particular ferocity that mothers feel for their first child. That love that is almost frightening in its intensity, that makes you understand for the first time that you would walk into traffic for another human being without a second thought. Daniel came 2 years later, in 1981, quieter and more watchful than his brother, the kind of child who observed everything and said less than he was thinking. Where Thomas burned bright and hot and demanded attention, Daniel collected information. Even as a small boy, he had the eyes of someone who was always calculating something. I stopped teaching when Daniel was born. Richard's business was growing, and we had talked about it, and I made the choice freely. I want to be clear about that, because in later years Thomas would use it against me, would call me just a housewife, as if the word was an insult, as if the 30 years I spent running our household and raising our children and managing every detail of our family's life were somehow less valuable than the work done in an office. I made the choice freely, and I would make it again. Through the 1980s, Richard's business grew into something extraordinary. Callaway Construction expanded from residential work in Connecticut to commercial projects across the Northeast. By the time Thomas was in middle school, we had moved from Westport to a house in Greenwich that had 7 bedrooms, a pool, 4 acres of garden, and a view of the Sound that made you feel, on clear mornings, like you were standing at the edge of the world. I want to describe that house to you because it matters, because it becomes, in this story, the thing everyone fights over, the symbol of everything they think they deserve and everything they've forgotten how to earn. The house was white, traditional New England colonial, with black shutters and a wide front porch that Richard rebuilt himself one summer when the wood rotted, because he believed in doing things with his own hands even when he could afford to pay someone else. The kitchen was large and yellow, always warm, always smelling of coffee and whatever I was cooking. The library had floor-to-ceiling shelves on 3 walls and a fireplace and 2 deep chairs, where Richard and I spent more evenings than I can count, reading in comfortable silence, occasionally reading passages aloud to each other. The master bedroom had windows on 3 sides. In the morning, when the light came in, it turned everything gold. I loved that house the way you love something you have helped build. Not the building itself, the life inside it. The Thanksgiving dinners for 30 people. The Christmas mornings when the boys were small and came thundering down the stairs at 5 a.m. The summer evenings on the porch with wine and neighbors, and the fireflies starting up in the garden. The arguments and the reconciliations and the ordinary Tuesday nights that you don't realize, while they're happening, are the very best parts of your life. Richard and I had 43 years of those Tuesday nights, and I would give every piece of what came after to have one more. He was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in the spring of 2018. He was 67 years old, still working, still the kind of man who arrived first and left last, who remembered the names of every person on every job site, who called his mother every Sunday even though she had dementia and sometimes thought he was his own father. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday. I remember because we had planned to go to dinner that evening, a new Italian place that one of our neighbors had recommended, and instead we sat in the oncologist's office while a kind young doctor told us something that rearranged every plan we had ever made. I will not tell you that we were perfect in those months. We weren't. There were nights when Richard raged against it, when the unfairness of it broke through his composure, and he said things that were not kind, and I said things back that were not kind either. And then we held each other in the dark and forgave everything, because what else do you do when you're terrified and the clock is running? There were days when the only thing I could do was hold his hand and watch television and pretend that everything was normal, which is its own kind of courage. But I will tell you that we were honest with each other. And I will tell you that Richard, even in those months, was thinking, planning, working. His mind never stopped. It was one of the things I had loved about him for 43 years, and it was still true even when his body was failing. He met with his attorneys. He reviewed documents. He made quiet arrangements that he did not tell me about. And he did not tell me because he knew me well enough to know that I would have argued, would have said it was morbid, would have said we weren't at that point yet, even when we both knew we were. He died on a Thursday morning in March, 3 years later than the doctors had predicted, which was very Richard. He had outlasted their timeline out of sheer stubbornness, and I believe because he wasn't finished yet. Thomas and Daniel were at the house when it happened. They had been coming and going throughout those final weeks, which I had believed was grief, which I had believed was love for their father. I understand now that it was reconnaissance. I had noticed things, of course. I am 71 years old, and I have been paying attention to people my entire life, and there are things you notice when you are the kind of woman who pays attention. I noticed that Thomas and his wife, Patricia, spent a great deal of time in Richard's study when Richard was sleeping. I noticed that Daniel had begun asking quiet questions about the business, not out of grief, not out of curiosity, but with the focused precision of someone who is conducting an inventory. I noticed that Patricia had stopped being warm to me in the small, subtle ways that women are warm to each other. The hand on the arm, the real smile instead of the performed one, and had replaced it with a particular kind of careful, watchful courtesy that told me she was managing me. I noticed all of it, and I said nothing, because Richard was dying and my husband needed me present, and I chose, in those weeks, to give all of myself to him and let the rest wait. The funeral was at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church in Greenwich, the same church where we had attended services for 30 years, where Father Michael had christened our grandchildren, and where Richard had served on the vestry board for a decade. There were 240 people at the service. Richard had touched a great many lives, and they came from everywhere. Old colleagues, former employees, neighbors from 3 different decades, people I hadn't seen in years who had driven 4 hours because they wanted to be there. Thomas gave the first eulogy. He stood at that podium and he spoke beautifully about his father, about Richard's work ethic, his integrity, his loyalty to the people who worked for him. He said the right things in the right order, and he made people cry, and I sat in the front pew and I thought, you are your father's son in every way that matters on the surface, and in no way that matters underneath. Father Michael's eulogy came after. It was 23 minutes long, and it was the truest thing spoken in that church that day. He talked about Richard's faith, not the performative kind, but the quiet, daily kind that showed up in how he treated people, and how he faced difficulty, and how he loved his family. He talked about a conversation he and Richard had had, he didn't say when, in which Richard had told him, Michael, the only thing I've ever been really proud of is that I tried to do right by the people I loved. Whether I succeeded, I'll have to leave that to them to say. I looked at my sons during that part of the eulogy. Thomas was looking at his hands. Daniel was looking at the ceiling. Neither of them was crying. We buried Richard on a Friday. The October sky was that particular shade of deep blue that only comes in fall in New England, and the leaves were at peak color, which Richard would have loved. He had always loved the fall. He said once that dying in October in New England was the most aesthetically appropriate death a person could ask for, which I had told him was a horrible thing to say, and which had made him laugh his particular laugh, the one that started low and built slowly, like a fire catching. I held myself together through the service at the graveside. I held myself together while they lowered the coffin. I held myself together while Father Michael said the final words, while the guests began to shift and murmur and turn toward each other with the particular relief of people who have completed a difficult obligation. And then Thomas stepped in front of me. He was wearing Richard's watch. I noticed it immediately, a Patek Philippe that Richard had bought himself at 60 as a gift to mark the business's 40th anniversary. Richard had never, in all the years I had known him, offered that watch to Thomas. He had never spoken about leaving it to him. And there it was on Thomas's wrist, and Thomas had apparently decided that the moment the coffin was in the ground was the appropriate time to make certain statements without saying them aloud. Mom, he said, and his voice was the voice he used for business, the confident, slightly flat voice that told you he had already decided the outcome and was just getting through the formality of the conversation. We need to talk about the house. I looked at him. Patricia was standing slightly behind him and to his right, in the position of a woman who has rehearsed this moment. Daniel was 3 feet away, looking at the grave. We've spoken with the attorneys, Thomas continued. Dad's estate is more complex than you probably realized. There are a lot of moving parts, and given your age and... He paused, and what he inserted into that pause was everything. Everything. We think it would be better for everyone if you let us handle the estate process. We can find you something appropriate, something manageable. Something manageable, I said. A condo, maybe. Somewhere smaller. You don't need that whole house, Mom. It's too much for one person. I looked at him for a long moment. I looked at Patricia. I looked at Daniel, who still had not met my eyes. "You have no right to anything," Thomas said, and his voice was very clear and very even. And then he smiled. The world went very quiet. I was aware of the faces turning toward me. I was aware of the weight of the moment, the way it pressed down on everything. I was aware, in my chest, of something that was not quite pain and not quite rage, but was somewhere between the two. A feeling like a seam splitting, like something giving way that had been held too tight for too long. I turned around, and I walked. I walked past the headstones and the oak trees and the little fountain, and I did not look back, and I did not cry, and I did not stop until I heard Father Michael's footsteps behind me and felt the weight of the envelope in my hands. That evening, alone in the kitchen with my cup of tea, I read what Richard had left me. The letter was 4 pages long, handwritten in Richard's careful architectural script, the handwriting of a man who had spent a lifetime drawing plans and reading blueprints, and understood that precision on paper was a form of respect for the people who would read it. He began, "My darling Stephanie, if you are reading this, then one of 2 things has happened. Either I was right about our sons, or Father Michael got confused and gave you the wrong envelope, in which case this will be very embarrassing for everyone. I suspect it's the first one. Even then, even in that moment, he made me laugh. That was Richard," he went on. "He wrote about the business. He wrote about the house. He wrote about things he had noticed over the years. Small things, accumulated things. The record of a man who paid attention and said little and remembered everything. He wrote, 'I love Thomas and Daniel. I want you to know that and to hold on to it. But loving your children does not mean being blind to who they are. And I have watched for a long time who they are becoming. The inheritance they are expecting is real, but so is the one they don't know about.' He explained it all, the structure he had put in place quietly over the last 2 years of his life, with the help of attorneys that neither Thomas nor Daniel had ever met, in a firm 2 states away where no one knew the Callaway name. The irrevocable trust, the way the estate was actually structured, the protections he had put around the house, around my financial security, around everything that was mine and that he had intended to remain mine. He had anticipated all of it. Every move they had made, he had seen coming and prepared for. At the end of the letter, he wrote, 'You are the strongest person I have ever known, Stephanie. You have spent 43 years making everything work while other people got the credit for it. Now I need you to let the attorneys work while you watch. It is going to be extremely satisfying, and I only regret that I cannot be there to see it with you. Give Father Michael my thanks. He is a good man and an excellent keeper of secrets. I love you. I have always loved you. I will love you in whatever comes next, whatever that turns out to be. Richard.' I sat at that kitchen table for a very long time. Outside, the October dark came down over the garden and the sound, and the house was full of the particular silence of a home that has lost someone. But for the first time since the oncologist's office 3 years earlier, I did not feel afraid. The next morning, I called the attorneys. Their names were Margaret Chen and David Okafor, partners at Hargrove and Associates in Boston. Richard had chosen them specifically because they had no connection to anyone in our Greenwich world, because he had understood, in his methodical way, that the less visible the protection, the more effective it would be. Margaret Chen was 52, precise, with the manner of someone who had seen every variety of family dysfunction and found it professionally interesting. David Okafor was 48, calm, with a voice that made you feel immediately that things were going to be handled correctly. They had been expecting my call. Richard had prepared them for it. He had given them the letter, the timeline, the specific instructions. They were, as Margaret put it when we spoke on the phone that first morning, fully ready to proceed. "Your husband," she said, in a tone of someone paying a genuine compliment, "was exceptionally thorough." "He was," I said. He was the most thorough person I have ever known. Meanwhile, Thomas and Daniel had already begun. I know this now, in detail, because discovery in litigation is a remarkable thing and makes visible what people believed they were doing in secret. But I knew some of it in real time, simply by being in the house and paying attention, which, as I have said, is something I have always been good at. Thomas called me 3 days after the funeral. His voice had shifted. The cemetery confrontation was apparently being reclassified in his mind as something more diplomatic, something he could smooth over with the right tone. "Mom, how are you doing? Patricia and I are worried about you." "I'm fine, Thomas." Good. Listen, the attorneys are going to be reaching out to you about some paperwork. I just want you to know that Daniel and I have already spoken with Dad's lawyer, and we have a pretty clear picture of the estate. We want to make this as easy as possible for you. Richard's estate planning attorney in Greenwich, a man named Gerald Whitmore who had handled Richard's business affairs for 20 years, had indeed met with Thomas and Daniel. What they did not know was that Gerald Whitmore had not been involved in the trust structure at all. He knew about the business succession plan, which was real and straightforward, and would transfer operational control to a management team Richard had spent 2 years assembling. What he did not know, what no one in Greenwich knew, was the rest. "That's very thoughtful of you," I said in my most pleasant voice. "I'm glad you see it that way. We just want what's best for you, Mom. The house is going to be a real burden." "Thomas," I said, "let me stop you there. I've already spoken with my attorneys." A pause. "Your attorneys?" "Yes, Hargrove and Associates in Boston. Margaret Chen will be in touch with Gerald Whitmore's office this week." Another pause, longer. "I think you'll find everything is in order." I heard something shift in his breathing, something recalibrate. "I wasn't aware you had retained separate counsel." "Well," I said pleasantly, "your father was a thorough man." I let that sit for a moment, and then I said I had to go, and I hung up. It took them 11 days to understand what they were dealing with. I know this because Margaret Chen kept me informed of every development with the kind of meticulous, almost affectionate attention to detail that told me she genuinely enjoyed her work. Thomas and Daniel had brought in their own attorneys, expensive ones from a firm in Manhattan, who reviewed the estate documents and then, presumably, delivered news that no one in that meeting wanted to receive. The trust was ironclad. Richard had established it 22 months before his death, when he was still legally competent by every standard, when there was no question of diminished capacity or undue influence. The house, all 4 acres and the building and its contents, was held in trust, with me as the sole beneficiary for the duration of my natural life. The financial assets were similarly structured. The business succession was separate and clean, transferring to the management team Richard had assembled, with provisions for Thomas and Daniel that were generous, more generous, frankly, than they deserved, but that left no control in their hands. They had expected to inherit everything. They had planned for it, calculated it, structured their lives around the assumption of it, and what they found instead was a wall, high, solid, built by a man who had understood them better than they had understood themselves. Thomas called again on the 12th day. "Mom, we need to talk." "We can talk," I said. "In person. Can I come to the house?" "Of course," I said. "It's still my house." He arrived on a Saturday morning, without Patricia, which told me he had decided to try a different approach. He sat at the kitchen table, my kitchen table, the yellow kitchen, the room that held more of my life than any other, and he looked at me with an expression I had never quite seen on his face before. It was somewhere between anger and something younger, something that reminded me, painfully, of the 8-year-old boy who used to come to me when he'd done something wrong and didn't know how to begin saying so. "The attorneys explained the trust," he said. "I know. Dad did all of this without telling us." "He did. Don't you think that's—" He stopped, started again. We're his sons, Mom. We spent our whole lives working toward what, Thomas? He looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in years. Toward being part of what he built, he said, and his voice was smaller than I had heard it since he was a teenager. Your father built that business through 40 years of work, I said carefully. He built this house, he built this family, and he did it all alongside me, because that is what a marriage is, even if it is not always visible to the people looking at it from the outside. I looked at him steadily. At the cemetery, Thomas, you told me I had no right to anything, in front of everyone we know, in front of your father's grave. He had the grace to look away. Your father had been planning for that moment for almost 2 years, I continued. He knew, or he suspected, which amounts to the same thing, that the moment he was gone, you and Daniel would move against me, and he made sure that I was protected. That is the kind of man your father was. That is the kind of marriage we had. I paused. The kind you clearly didn't believe existed. There was a long silence. I want you to think, I said, very carefully about what you do next. Not because I am threatening you, I am not, but because the choices you make in the next few months will determine what kind of people you are for the rest of your lives. Your father gave you everything he could. He gave you a good name and an education and every opportunity. He gave you more than most fathers ever give. What you do with that is entirely up to you. Thomas left that day without resolving anything, but something had shifted. I could feel it, the way you feel a change in barometric pressure before a storm. The question was which way it would break. Daniel, I should tell you, was a more complicated problem. Where Thomas operated loudly and from the front, Daniel operated quietly and from the side. It was Daniel who had spent those weeks in Richard's study, Daniel who had been asking the quiet questions, and it was Daniel who had hired a forensic accountant to review the business records, looking, I learned later, for irregularities that might give them grounds to challenge the trust. They didn't find any irregularities. Richard kept clean books. He had always kept clean books. But the attempt told me something important about Daniel that I had perhaps not fully understood before. He was willing to manufacture a reason if he couldn't find a real one. The forensic accountant found nothing actionable. The Manhattan attorneys found no grounds to challenge the trust. Thomas and Daniel were left with what they had always had, which was, in fact, quite a lot, if they had been willing to see it clearly. Provisions in the trust, their father's name, the company, which would throw off dividends, a legacy that most people would have been grateful for. But gratitude was not the emotion they had decided to feel. They filed a challenge. Undue influence, the argument that I had manipulated Richard in his final months, had pressured him into structuring the estate to benefit me at their expense. It was, as Margaret Chen said to me with clinical precision, a meritless claim, and they almost certainly knew it. But it was a way to fight, and they had decided to fight. I will not pretend that this did not hurt. It hurt in the way that only the truth can hurt, not because I was surprised, but because I had hoped, somewhere in the part of me that is still the woman who held those boys when they were small and loved them with the ferocious, unreasonable love of a mother, that I was wrong about them, that they would stop, that something would reach them. Margaret was a bulldog in the best possible sense. She had clearly spent her career preparing for exactly this kind of case, and she brought to it a meticulous, thorough, almost joyful competence. Depositions were scheduled, documents were gathered, Richard's medical team testified. The attorneys who had drafted the trust testified. Father Michael testified, quietly, carefully, about the conversations he had had with Richard, about Richard's state of mind, about the letter, and what Richard had told him about his sons. Father Michael was 74 years old, and he had been a priest for 46 years, and he sat in that deposition chair with the calm of a man who had seen everything and feared nothing, and he said, clearly and without hesitation, that Richard Calloway had been one of the clearest-minded, most intentional people he had ever known, that the trust had been Richard's deliberate and considered decision, and that the characterization of Stephanie Calloway as a manipulative influence was so far from the truth of their marriage as to be almost unrecognizable. The opposing attorneys tried to shake him. They did not succeed. The case went on for 14 months. 14 months of paperwork and depositions and hearings, and the grinding, exhausting machinery of litigation, which I navigated from the yellow kitchen with my tea and my phone and the steady, reassuring voices of Margaret and David. I did not enjoy those months, but I was not afraid. Richard had given me something that nothing and no one could take away: the knowledge that I had been seen, fully and clearly, by the person who mattered most. That knowledge turned out to be the most substantial thing I had ever owned. There was a hearing in month 11 that I will remember for the rest of my life. Thomas's attorney was questioning me about the last 2 years of Richard's illness, trying to build the picture of a woman who had isolated her husband and controlled his decisions. He was skilled at it, asking questions that contained their own accusations, constructing an image with no single false statement, but with an overall shape that was a lie. I let him build it, and then I answered. I answered quietly and in detail, describing the 11 months of daily medical appointments and medication management, and the nights when Richard couldn't sleep and I sat up with him. I described the way we talked through every decision together, the way he had insisted on understanding every document before he signed it, even when he was exhausted, the way he had called Margaret Chen himself from his own phone without me in the room, multiple times during the drafting process. I described the marriage, 43 years of it, in the steady, plain language of a woman who does not need to exaggerate, because the truth is sufficient. When I was done, the room was very quiet. Thomas was looking at the table. Daniel had his hand over his mouth, and their attorney, to his credit, simply moved on, because there was nothing left to do with what I had said. The judge ruled in my favor on a Thursday in January. The trust was upheld in its entirety. The challenge was dismissed. The attorney's fees, which were considerable, which were the kind of fees that make you understand why people settle rather than fight, were assessed against Thomas and Daniel. I was in Margaret's office when we got the ruling. She read it to me in full, which took about 20 minutes, and at the end she looked up and said, "Stephanie, you won." I thought about Richard. I thought about the yellow kitchen and the 43 Tuesdays and the snow on the chapel windows in 1976. I thought about the envelope in Father Michael's hand at the cemetery, the cream-colored envelope with my name in Richard's careful handwriting. "We won," I said. In the year that followed, things settled into their new shape. Thomas and Patricia restructured their finances. The attorney's fees had been a significant blow, and without the inheritance they had been counting on, certain plans had to change. Thomas left the management of the business. He had been hoping to influence the transition, and the management team Richard had assembled took over smoothly. The company performed well. The dividends Thomas received were substantial. He was, by any reasonable measure, a wealthy man. He had simply wanted to be a different, larger kind of wealthy man, and the difference between what he had and what he had wanted was apparently what he chose to feel. Daniel was quieter about all of it, which was in keeping with his nature. He and I had one phone conversation, about 8 months after the ruling, that lasted 40 minutes and covered territory I had not expected. He said things that were as close to an apology as I believe Daniel is capable of, which is not nothing and is not everything. I accepted it in the spirit it was offered. We are not close, but we speak. At Christmas, he calls. Thomas and I did not speak for almost 2 years. And then, on a Sunday in October, fall again, always fall in New England, he came to the house alone. He stood on the porch, and I opened the door, and he looked at me with the face of a man who had been working his way toward something for a long time and had finally arrived. "I need to say something," he said. I let him in. We sat at the kitchen table. He talked for almost an hour. It was not comfortable, and it was not elegant, and it was not the kind of apology you see in movies, with the swelling music and the perfectly chosen words. It was messy and halting and occasionally defensive and ultimately real. He talked about his father, about the weight of growing up in Richard's shadow and wanting to be worthy of it, and somehow, somewhere along the way, deciding that what he was owed was more important than what he had earned. He talked about Patricia, about the ways her ambitions had become entangled with his own until he couldn't always tell them apart. He talked about the cemetery, about standing in front of his father's grave and saying what he had said, and about the look on my face when I turned and walked away. A look, he said, that he thought about more than anything else in those years. "You looked," he said, "exactly like Dad." I poured him a cup of coffee. We sat with it for a while. "I can't give you back what I took from you at that cemetery," he said. "I know that. I just need you to know that I'm sorry for it." I looked at my son, my firstborn, who I had loved since the moment I held him in the delivery room, and Richard wept with joy. The man he had become, and the man he was, I hoped, still becoming. "I know you are," I said. "We are not what we were before all of this. I don't think we will be. Some things that break do not go back to exactly the shape they had, and pretending otherwise is its own kind of dishonesty. But we are something. We have dinner occasionally. He and Patricia came for Thanksgiving last year. There were moments at that table that felt almost like the ones I used to have when the boys were young, and Richard was at the head of the table, and the house was full of noise and warmth, and the feeling that we had built something real. I live in the house still, the white house with the black shutters, and the view of the Sound and the yellow kitchen where I drink my tea. In the mornings, when the light comes in through the bedroom windows, it still turns everything gold. I have Richard's letter framed on the wall of the library, between the fireplace and the shelves. I had it professionally mounted on archival paper, behind museum glass, with a small brass label at the bottom that says, R.J. Calloway, 2021. People who visit sometimes ask about it, and I tell them it's a letter from my husband. They ask what it says, and I tell them it says everything I needed to hear at the moment I most needed to hear it. Father Michael retired last year. We had lunch at a restaurant in Greenwich to celebrate, just the two of us, and at the end of it he raised his glass of iced tea and said, "To Richard, who knew his family better than they knew themselves." I raised mine. "To Richard." We drank to him in the afternoon light, in the town where we had spent our lives, and I thought about how strange and how full a life can be, how much loss it holds, and how much love, how the two are sometimes the same thing, how the people we love most are capable of both the deepest wounds and the greatest protections. Richard protected me. Even after he was gone, he protected me. He saw what was coming, because he had spent 43 years learning to see clearly, and he built a wall around what mattered, and he put the key in Father Michael's hand and trusted that I would know what to do with it. I knew. I am 71 years old. I have a house I love and a library full of books and a garden that is somewhat out of control and a view of the Sound that makes me feel, on clear mornings, like I am standing at the edge of the world. I have 2 sons who are flawed and complicated, and mine. I have the memory of 43 years, with the most thorough, most loving, most quietly extraordinary person I have ever known. I have everything I need. If this story reached something in you, if you have ever been the person in that cemetery, hearing the words that were meant to make you feel like nothing, holding yourself together until you could get to the car, please leave a comment. Tell me your story. Tell me you're okay, or tell me you're not yet, but you're working on it. Tell me you believe, as I do now, with everything I have been through, that preparation is love and patience is power, and the people who underestimate you are only giving you time to get ready. Hit that like button if you believe that love, real love, doesn't end when someone is gone. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this one, because this was my story, but it is not the only one, and there are more to come. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, the most powerful thing you can do in the face of people who want to take from you is to stand straight, walk away, and trust that the right envelope will find you. I trusted that, and it did.